Hey, I'm Tom from Playerflight Miniature Painting. Today I'll show you how to speed paint the galaxy's greatest vampire cosplayers, and I've taken it as a bit of a challenge to do it with as few colours as possible. I used a graffiti art spray paint to prime and base coat the model. This is a little thicker than the spray paint created specifically for miniature painting, and it can create a little bit of texture. On the power armour, I quite like that effect. It makes the armour look ceramic, but the metallics still end up looking a little rough, and I would prefer them to be a bit smoother. If you use this type of paint, I'd recommend spraying at a time when the air isn't too dry. If you can slow down the drying time, the paint will have time to level itself out. The colour seems a little unusual at the moment, but the oil layer will fix that, and this colour will only dominate in the highlights. For our highest highlight, we can dry brush with a sunny skin tone, moving the brush from top to bottom. This will hit the upward facing edges and the most raised details. The Codex colour scheme for Blood Angels uses black for the trim, the leather and the body of the gun. Since this is such a major colour, it would look better if it's on the colour wheel rather than just being black with grey highlights. So we can base coat with a Prussian blue. This is a dark turquoise blue. Purity seals are painted with red for the wax. This makes them a slightly different colour to the armour, and bone for the parchment. If there are any skulls or bones on the model, paint them the same way as the parchment from here on in. Then you can add the insignia, either with transfers or by freehand, and then spray a matte varnish over top of the model. This protects the paint, and the matte finish has a microscopic texture which will grab the oil pigments, taking the stain a bit better. Metallic paints can go on top of the varnish, so they keep their shine. We start the oil layer by mixing a dark crimson. This is based on an alizarin crimson. The crimson is thinned with white spirits and darkened with a phthalo green. This ends up being about a 10:1 ratio. But the final mix should be very dark where it's thick. We call this the mass tone, and where it's thin we should still have a nice crimson. We call this the undertone. Contrast paints have the same effect, but oil paints give us far more control. I've used an artist grade paint here since the acrylic base coat was so far from the final red. Artist grade paints have proportionately more pigment and more staining power. If the base coat was redder, a cheaper student grade paint would suffice, but there would be less contrast. And for a black mix, take some of the crimson mix and just add a bit more phthalo green. The end result will probably be about a 4 or 5:1 mix of crimson to green. Just keep adding the green little by little until the undertone becomes a smoky violet or Payne's grey. For the parchment, you could get a worn finish by painting it with an opaque dark brown like I did in my Crimson Fists video, but to limit the number of paints, I'll just use the light brown that I've included for painting the head later on. Darken it with some of the black mix. Since all the pigments used in this mix are transparent, the transitions will be fairly smooth and the parchment will look quite fresh. I've put an Alkyd medium, Liquin, into these mixes to speed up the dry time, but it will make the models a little glossier in the end. If you have more than one batch to paint, you can make large mixes and put the excess in airtight jars, storing them somewhere cool. Apply the paint thickly. I think it's best to start in the hardest to reach areas and work your way outwards, even if that means switching between colours. Put the red mix on the wax as well as the armour, the black goes on the metallics as well as the Prussian blue, and the brown goes on the parchment. Wait till all of the white spirits have evaporated and there's no more pools of fluid, then we can start cleaning the model. There's 3 stages of cleaning. First with a dry sponge or Q-tip, rub everything you can reach. Then with a Q-tip or a brush dipped in water you can make more focused broad highlights. And finally, with a brush dipped in white spirits, you can do some very focused cleaning on the insignia and create some edge highlights. Transparent pigments will darken anything they're painted on top of. The mass tone will colour the recesses, with the oil paint stayed thickest, giving you free panel lining. The undertone will stain the rest of the model. This will dominate in the mid-tones, but in the highlights the acrylic colour will be dominant. Then you can put them in a clean box to keep the dust off them and leave them to dry for a couple of days. Unless they're made of resin, I'd leave them in the sunshine. The heat speeds up the drying. Once the oil is dry and no longer sticky to the touch, we can finish off the model. As humans, we tend to look at the model's eyes first, so it's worth putting a little extra effort into this part of the model. For a standard green lens, use 3 colours: dark green, lime green and white. For this dark green, I've just mixed lime green with a bit of Prussian blue. Base coat the lens in the dark green, then for a top-down light, put a lime green crescent around the bottom third of the lens, preserving a dark green line around the very bottom edge, and then put a tiny white dash about 2/3 of the way up the lens. To be honest, I had to redo one of these eyes a few times, and after doing a couple of them, it only took about a minute a lens, so it's worth redoing them until you get a decent quality. Brush paint a matte varnish onto the non-metal areas. With an ultra matte varnish, a single rough coat will be perfect. Then base your model as you normally would. I've gone with a homemade texture paint mixed from wall filler, PVA glue and craft paint. Then added some tufts, shaded the recesses with a wash and dry brushed it. This model took less than an hour's work to complete, not including the oil mixing, which only needs to be done once. So with these methods, a person could get a high quality armour done without a huge amount of time investment. The more elite models do look great with bare heads, so on a second model I'll show you how to paint a head alongside everything else. On a face, mistakes will stand out, so to get better access it's best to keep the head disconnected until the painting is finished. The collar can be painted the same way as the rest of the armour, but the skin and blonde hair are both base coated in bone and then matte varnished. The main paint used here is a transparent, or at least semi-transparent raw sienna. I'm using the Winton version. This has very little covering power, so I'm not going to dilute it with any white spirits, just a little bit of liquid. Raw sienna alone is perfect for blonde hair, but for the skin add a touch of alizarin crimson, aiming for a colour similar to that of flesh wash. Once the paint is applied, precise cleaning is key to a good effect, so use only a brush. Starting with it dry, begin the highlights and smooth out any lumps of paint, then with white spirits you can boost the highest highlights. The hair is a reflective surface, so the highest highlights should be in a ring around the dome of the head, with the top being only slightly lighter than the sides. For the eyes, start with the sclera, or the so-called white of the eye, which is actually a light grey. I've created a grey by mixing a little blue and bone into white, favouring the blue to create a contrast with the warm tones of the face. Then dot the pupils. You could do this using paint, but a nice cheat is to use a micron pen. Then glue the head back to the body, and it's finished.